Hello, good afternoon. Today is 29th of May 2021, and this is part 2 of our Solos Jesus series. Last time we looked at whether Jesus really did exist and saw from the evidence that he did. Jesus is not a myth. The other question that usually arises is as to whether the Gospels and the New Testament are a reliable account of Jesus' life, his teachings, right? Some theorize that Jesus did live among us, but the Gospel accounts do not give a reliable account or record of his life and teachings. And some even say the disciples lied. And there's even a story that he did not die on the cross. There's a theory that he did not die on the cross, but escaped and went off to modern day France with Mary of Magdala, whom he married, and started a family. In fact, there was a huge movie about this based on a book written by, I think it was Dan Brown. That story has been around for decades. Anyway, I remember reading something similar when I was 16 years old or so. Now, the question really is this true? Are the Gospels and the New Testament accounts a reliable record of Jesus' life? Early Christians in the first century, including Jesus' apostles, attested to his life, death, and burial and resurrection. Many of them on the pain of death. They insisted that he lived, insisted that he taught the things that he did, and insisted that they actually saw him after he rose from the dead. And it's very hard for people to insist, and they killed them for insisting on this. Some were hung, crucified upside down, and so many other things. It's very hard for people to die for a lie they're telling knowingly, but they insist on it. So for me, that gives pause for thought, that yes, there is something to this. They did believe, and they insisted that they saw, and they saw him and spent time with him and ate with him even after he resurrected, and insist that he ascended up to heaven in their very before, as we like to say in Nigeria. The other thing is, generally speaking, right, the shorter the time frame of an event and the time frame between an event happening and the report or record of that event, the less likely it is that event or the retelling of that event will be distorted. The Gospels, for ancient manuscripts, according to by going by ancient manuscript standards, the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament were written within about 70 years after Jesus died. Compare this time frame with other classic literary texts. For example, we look at Buddha. Information about the Buddha's life was not committed to writing until several centuries after his death. In fact, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, I quote, "The events of his life cannot be regarded with confidence as historical, although his historical existence is accepted by scholars. Images for traditional sources on his passage into Nirvana range from any time between 2,420 years before Christ to 290 years before Christ. The canon containing the discourses attributed to the Buddha were transmitted orally and first written down probably during the 1st century BC, so at least 100 years after the death of the historical Buddha." I end the quote. Scholars generally apply 3 tests to determine the reliability of historical documents. I'm going to get a little technical here. I'll put up the list of these tests. First, there's the bibliographical test. Secondly, the internal evidence test. And thirdly, the external evidence test. So what are these, and how do the Gospels and the New Testament stack up against these criteria? So let's start with the bibliographical test. This raises the question, how many copies exist of the original and how much time elapsed between the time of writing the original and when the first copy and the time that the first copy was made? Of course, the lesser the time elapsed, the more reliable the document is considered to be. So if we look at, for example, Homer's Iliad, there's a time gap of 400 years between the writing of the original copy and then the first copy when it was written, and there's 643 copies. Not too bad. 400 years, I think, is a lot of time, but still, for a historical manuscript, okay, fair enough. The other person I'll look at is Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. This basically recounted the 5th century BC wars between Sparta and Athens. He wrote his manuscript maybe around 411 BC. We're not too sure, but before 400 BC anyway. But the earliest copies of his manuscript came about 1,300 years later, and there are 8 copies. Now, Contrast this with the New Testament, which had its earliest manuscript surfacing 30 years after the events, right? And they kept writing until 110 AD. By 110 AD, the New Testament was complete, right? And there are over 5,600 manuscripts which contain all or part of the Greek New Testament. According to Professor Edward Glennie, a professor of New Testament studies and Greek, he says that the New Testament is the most remarkably preserved book in the ancient world. So not only do we have a great number of manuscripts, but they're very close in time to the originals that they represent. So I would say that the Gospels pass the bibliographical test. Don't you think so? Second test, the internal evidence test. Question is, does the document contradict itself internally? So we know there are 4 Gospels. And the question is, do they contradict themselves? Now, while there are no contradictions in the major doctrinal issues, Jesus lived, they all agree. Jesus taught, they all agreed. He performed miracles, he died, he rose from the dead. They all say they saw him after he rose from the dead. And they say that he's Lord. They attest to all these things. But there are a few differences in some details in the account. So for example, in the account of the demoniac who had a legion of demons within him that were cast out and into a herd of pigs. For example, Mark 5 and Luke chapter 8, Mark and Luke accounts speak of only one demoniac, while the Matthew account speaks of 2 demoniacs. Why could this be? How could this be? Now, some say it's likely that Mark and Luke accounts focused on the more dominant person of the 2 demoniacs, who was maybe the one speaking, and thus gave an incomplete account, while Matthew gave a more detailed report. And indeed, in any given incident with several eyewitnesses and people reporting, there may be agreement on the overall big picture. Okay, this is what happened. This guy was, they cast out this demon, and the pigs, the demons went into the pigs and they were drowned as a result of that. But they may differ in differences on details. Sometimes we witness a crowd, we see speakers, and we say, okay, a group of people who are speaking on behalf of another group, and we say, okay, this person, the main spokesperson will now say, oh, the one person came, or this person came, and or some people say they came as a group, but it does not take away from the big event that happened. So sometimes there are those details. I find that when I'm faced with such seeming discrepancies and seeming contradictions, they're usually in scripture, they're usually clarified by further study, once I take time to examine the text closely and to cross-reference with related Bible passages, or to examine the language, the context, look at the history around the issue, or look at even the archaeological evidence or scientific evidence that may have surfaced since then. It takes time, but it's usually very, very rewarding. If you read, for example, the prophecies of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and you juxtapose them against some of the things that we see predicted in Revelation, or even the unfolding of Jesus' life in the New Testament, it's amazing and remarkable how consistent the scriptures is. In all my years of studying historical different things and studying different texts, I've never seen a text that is as consistent as the Bible. The other test, and the last test we'll talk about, is the external evidence test. Does the document contradict external sources of historical fact? From the last video, we saw when we talked about Jesus' life, crucifixion, the testimony of his disciples, even the martyrdom of his brother James, we saw that all of these were documented variously, bits here and there, by non-biblical sources. For example, Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, which is now in modern-day Turkey, and then the Jewish historian Josephus. So, for me, Jesus existed, 1. 2, the record. We've seen the evidence, we've seen some of this. Please take your time and study out a little more about this. In the next, we'll continue the series and go deeper into the person, taking a deeper look at Jesus' person, his character, things we can learn from him, and his teaching is his own teaching, what he taught on different things, and what lessons we can draw from those for life in the 21st century Nigeria right now, and the world. Indeed, things are extremely challenging, and we're tempted to give up because there's so much carnage. And interestingly, our time now is very similar, probably, to the time Jesus' life. But we can, when we hold on to God, keep our minds stayed on Jesus, on God, and trust for his peace. The Bible indeed says that he will keep in perfect peace he whose mind is stayed on him. And I pray that God will give you his peace at this time. God bless you. Have a great weekend.